It was a cold November night, and the emptiness of my house echoed with every step. In the corner of the property, a shadow caught my attention. I saw a woman, weary, and as she stumbled, I reached out my hand. "Come in. It's cold out there," I said, not knowing that this gesture would change everything. In the sprawling hills of Connecticut, where old money whispered through ancient oak trees, Maxwell Richardson's mansion stood as a testament to both wealth and solitude. The 75-year-old business tycoon had everything money could buy, yet the 20,000-square-foot estate felt more like a museum of memories than a home. Every evening, as the sun painted the sky in hues of amber and purple, Maxwell would walk through his meticulously maintained gardens, his Italian leather shoes crunching against the gravel paths. On this particular autumn evening, the air carried a distinct chill that seemed to mirror the emptiness in his heart. 5 years had passed since Eleanor, his beloved wife of 4 decades, had departed this world, leaving him alone in their grand home. The staff, though efficient and loyal, couldn't fill the void that grew larger with each passing day. Maxwell paused near Eleanor's favorite rose garden, where white roses still bloomed as if keeping her memory alive. His weathered hands, marked by years of building his real estate empire, trembled slightly as he touched a delicate petal. The garden had been Eleanor's sanctuary, where she would spend hours tending to her beloved flowers while humming classical melodies. The sound of rustling leaves drew his attention to the far corner of the garden, near the old stone wall that marked the property's boundary. At first he dismissed it as the wind, but then he saw her. A woman probably in her late 40s with dignity in her posture, despite her worn clothes and tired eyes. She stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights, one hand clutching a tattered backpack. "The gates are usually locked," Maxwell said, more curious than alarmed. His security system was state-of-the-art, and the fact that she had managed to get this far intrigued him. The woman straightened her shoulders, her grey-streaked dark hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "I found a gap in the hedge," she admitted, her voice carrying an unexpected refinement. "I've been sleeping in the woods behind your property. I meant no harm. I'll leave immediately." Something in her eyes caught Maxwell's attention, a familiar pain, a reflection of his own loneliness perhaps, but mixed with an undeniable strength. Despite her circumstances, she carried herself with grace, like someone who had known better days. "Wait," Maxwell called out as she turned to leave. "The nights are getting colder. There's a guest house on the property that hasn't been used in years." The words surprised him as much as they did her. Eleanor had always told him he had good instincts about people, and something about this woman stirred his dormant compassion. The woman hesitated, suspicion warring with desperation in her expression. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because Eleanor would have," he replied simply, the name of his late wife falling naturally from his lips. "She never turned away someone in need. I'm Maxwell Richardson." "Sarah?" she responded after a long pause. "Sarah Collins." She seemed to wrestle with an internal struggle before adding, "I can't accept charity, Mr. Richardson." Maxwell gestured toward the guest house visible through the trees. "Then consider it an exchange. The house needs attention, and my staff is stretched thin. You can earn your keep by helping maintain it." Sarah's eyes darted between Maxwell and the guest house, calculating, weighing options. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "For a few days," she conceded, "until I figure out my next move." As they walked toward the guest house, Maxwell noticed Sarah taking in her surroundings with an artist's eye, her gaze lingering on the play of light through the trees, the architectural details of the main house, the careful composition of the gardens. It reminded him of Eleanor's way of seeing beauty in everything. The guest house, though unused, was maintained like everything else on the property. It was a comfortable 2-story structure with its own small garden, designed to match the main house's Georgian architecture. As Maxwell unlocked the door, the motion sensors activated warm lighting throughout the space. "There's a fully stocked kitchen," Maxwell explained, leading her through the ground floor. "The bedroom upstairs should have everything you need. My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, will bring fresh linens and toiletries." Sarah stood in the center of the living room, looking both out of place and somehow perfectly at home. "This is too much," she whispered, but Maxwell could see her fighting back tears of relief. "Get some rest," he said, heading toward the door. "Mrs. Chen will check on you in the morning." He paused at the threshold, turning back. "Sarah, Whatever you're running from, you're safe here. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion, but she said nothing. Maxwell left her standing in the middle of the guest house, her silhouette framed by the warm lights behind her. As he walked back to the main house, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. That night, as Maxwell sat in his study reviewing property documents, his thoughts kept drifting to his mysterious guest. There was something about Sarah that spoke to the protective instinct he'd developed over years of caring for Eleanor through her illness. But there was more to it, a nagging feeling that their paths crossing wasn't mere chance. Looking out his study window toward the guest house, where a single light still burned in the upper window, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. Eleanor had always told him that the greatest adventures often begin with a single act of kindness. As he prepared for bed, he smiled at her portrait on his bedside table, wondering if somehow she had orchestrated this entire encounter from wherever she was now. The following weeks brought subtle changes to the Richardson estate. Sarah proved to be more than just a temporary guest. She became an unexpected source of renewal for the aging property. Her presence breathed life into corners long forgotten, starting with the guest house, which she transformed with an artist's touch, rearranging furniture to maximize natural light, adding wildflowers in simple vases, and creating intimate reading nooks that made the space feel lived in. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the guest house's storage rooms, Sarah discovered something that made her heart skip a beat. Eleanor's old art studio. The room was perfectly preserved, with easels still standing, paint tubes carefully arranged, and canvases stacked against the walls. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light that pierced through the window, giving the space an almost ethereal quality. Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched a paintbrush, memories flooding back from a time before her life had unraveled. She had once been a promising artist herself, before circumstances forced her to abandon her passion. The studio felt like a sign, a whisper from the past urging her to reclaim what she had lost. Maxwell found her there, standing motionless before an empty canvas. Eleanor would spend hours here, he said softly, making Sarah jump. She always said this room had the perfect light. He moved closer, noting the way Sarah's hand lingered on the paintbrush. "Do you paint?" "I used to," Sarah admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "It feels like a lifetime ago." Maxwell studied her face, seeing the longing in her eyes. Everything still in working order. Eleanor was very particular about her supplies. He gestured to the well-organized shelves of paints and brushes. "You should use it." Sarah shook her head, taking a step back. "I couldn't possibly—" "The studio has been silent for too long," Maxwell insisted. "Eleanor would have wanted it to be used, to have art created within these walls again." He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a fresh canvas. "Consider it part of your contribution to the estate, bringing this space back to life." That evening, after Maxwell had retired to the main house, Sarah returned to the studio. Her hands shook as she set up the canvas, selected brushes, and squeezed paint onto a palette. The first brushstroke felt like coming home. Colors flowed from her brush, deep blues, rich purples, hints of gold, creating an abstract landscape of emotion. Hours passed unnoticed as Sarah worked, lost in the therapeutic rhythm of creation. The painting took shape beneath her hands, a solitary figure emerging from darkness into light, surrounded by swirling colors that suggested both chaos and hope. It was raw, honest work, born from years of suppressed creativity and pain. Mrs. Chen found her there the next morning, asleep in a paint-splattered chair. The housekeeper's gasp of surprise woke Sarah, who immediately began apologizing for the mess. But Mrs. Chen wasn't looking at the scattered paint tubes or the water-stained rags. Her eyes were fixed on the canvas. "Mr. Richardson must see this," she declared, hurrying from the room before Sarah could protest. Maxwell arrived minutes later, still in his morning robe. He stood before the painting in silence, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, suddenly feeling vulnerable, exposed through her art in a way that made her want to run and hide. "This is extraordinary," Maxwell finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're not just someone who paints, Sarah. You're an artist." He turned to face her, his eyes bright with excitement. "This reminds me of Eleanor's early work, not in style, but in its emotional depth. She would have loved this." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. I haven't painted in 7 years, she confessed. I didn't think I could anymore. Sometimes we need the right moment, the right place to rediscover ourselves, Maxwell replied. He looked around the studio thoughtfully. This space is yours now if you want it. Paint whenever inspiration strikes. Over the next few days, Sarah spent every free moment in the studio. Each painting became more confident than the last, as years of pent-up creativity found release. Maxwell would often sit quietly in a corner, watching her work, occasionally sharing stories about Eleanor and her own artistic journey. The paintings began to accumulate, landscapes filled with turbulent skies, portraits of nameless figures with haunting eyes, abstract pieces that seemed to pulse with barely contained energy. Each one revealed another layer of Sarah's soul, though she carefully avoided any subjects that might hint at her past. Word of Sarah's talent began to spread through the household staff. Mrs. Chen proudly showed photos of the paintings to her daughter, an art gallery assistant in New York. The younger woman's excitement about the works reached her boss, Victoria Chen, owner of the prestigious Chen Gallery in Manhattan. One morning, Maxwell received a call from Victoria requesting a private viewing of Sarah's work. He found Sarah in the studio, working on her largest canvas yet, a massive triptych that seemed to tell a story of transformation. How would you feel about showing your work to a gallery owner? Maxwell asked carefully, watching her reaction. Sarah's brush froze mid-stroke. Fear flickered across her face, quickly replaced by longing. I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of exposure, she said quietly. You can't hide your light forever, Sarah, Maxwell replied gently. Sometimes the path to healing requires us to be seen. Sarah stared at her painting, conflict evident in every line of her body. Finally, she nodded slowly. Just a private viewing, she agreed. Nothing more. What neither of them knew was that this decision would set in motion events that would force Sarah to confront the very past she was trying to escape, and test the fragile trust building between them. As Maxwell left the studio that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than art. The day of Victoria Chen's visit dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the nervous energy that filled the Richardson estate. Sarah had spent the previous night arranging her paintings in the studio, each placement carefully considered to tell a visual story of her artistic journey. Maxwell, sensing her anxiety, had kept his distance, offering support through small gestures. A fresh pot of coffee left outside the studio door, a vase of Eleanor's white roses placed on the windowsill. Victoria Chen arrived precisely at 10 a.m., her sleek black car crunching up the gravel driveway. Maxwell greeted her on the front steps, struck by the gallery owner's commanding presence. Victoria was a woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, her short silver hair styled in a fashionable asymmetric cut. Her sharp eyes took in every detail of the mansion's facade before settling on Maxwell. Mr. Richardson, she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand, it's an honor to meet you. Your reputation in the real estate world precedes you. Maxwell shook her hand, noting the firm grip. The honor is mine, Miss Chen. Your gallery is highly respected in the art community. Please follow me. As they walked towards the guest house, Victoria's gaze swept over the grounds. You have a beautiful estate, she commented. It's rare to see such well-maintained historical properties these days. Thank you, Maxwell replied. It's been in my family for generations. My late wife, Eleanor, was particularly passionate about preserving its character. At the mention of Eleanor, Victoria's eyes lit up with recognition. Eleanor Richardson, the abstract expressionist? I had no idea. Her early works were groundbreaking. Maxwell nodded, a wistful smile touching his lips. The studio we're visiting was hers. It seems fitting that it's found new life through another talented artist. They entered the guest house, where Sarah was waiting in the foyer. Maxwell made the introductions, noting the way Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she shook Victoria's hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Ms. Chen, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Please call me Victoria, the gallery owner replied, her keen eyes taking in Sarah's appearance. I'm looking forward to seeing your work. Sarah led them into the studio, where the morning light streamed through the large windows, illuminating the canvases arranged throughout the room. Victoria moved slowly from piece to piece, her expression neutral as she studied each painting intently. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional murmur from Victoria as she leaned in to examine a brushstroke or stepped back to take in a composition. Maxwell watched Sarah, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the way she unconsciously held her breath each time Victoria paused before a new piece. He wanted to offer words of encouragement, but knew this moment was crucial for Sarah to face on her own. After what seemed like hours, Victoria turned to face them, her professional mask finally cracking into a genuine smile. "Sarah," she said, "your work is remarkable. There's a raw emotional quality here, a depth of feeling that's rare to find in contemporary art. I'm particularly drawn to your use of color and the way you balance abstraction with representational elements." Sarah's eyes widened, a flush of pride coloring her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot to hear that from someone of your expertise." Victoria nodded, her gaze sharp. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of featuring your work in my gallery, perhaps a small solo exhibition to introduce you to the New York art scene." The color drained from Sarah's face as quickly as it had appeared. "An exhibition," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of exposure." Victoria's eyebrow arched slightly. "Art is meant to be seen, Sarah. Your work deserves an audience." She turned to Maxwell. "Mr. Richardson, would you mind if I spoke with Sarah privately for a moment?" Maxwell glanced at Sarah, seeing the panic in her eyes. "Of course," he said carefully. "I'll be just outside if you need anything." As Maxwell stepped out onto the porch, he couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and concern. Sarah's talent was undeniable, and she deserved recognition. But he also knew there was more to her story, secrets that made her hesitant to step into the spotlight. Inside the studio, Victoria's voice softened as she addressed Sarah. "I sense there's more holding you back than just artistic insecurity. Your work speaks of someone who has lived through significant pain and transformation. Whatever your past, it has shaped you into an artist of exceptional promise." Sarah's hands twisted together as she struggled to find words. "My past, it's complicated. There are people who I'd rather not have found me." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the need for discretion. We could use a pseudonym for the exhibition if you prefer. But Sarah, art has the power to heal, not just for the artist, but for those who experience it. Your paintings could touch lives in ways you can't imagine." As Sarah wrestled with the decision, her eyes fell on a canvas in the corner, one she didn't remember painting. Curious, she walked over to it, Victoria following. As Sarah turned the canvas to face them, both women gasped. The painting was dark, turbulent, depicting a scene of chaos and fear. In the center stood a figure that was unmistakably Sarah, younger and terrified, reaching out towards a hazy silhouette of a child. The background swirled with shapes that hinted at opulence and danger, a life of luxury, tainted by violence. "I don't remember painting this," Sarah whispered, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the canvas. Victoria studied the painting intently. "It's different from your other work, more representational, almost like a suppressed memory breaking through." She turned to Sarah, her expression gentle but probing. "Sometimes our art knows truths we're not yet ready to face." Sarah stared at the painting, feeling as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Memories she had fought so hard to bury were suddenly threatening to surface. The child in the painting, her daughter whom she had left behind to keep safe, seemed to be calling out to her across time and canvas. Maxwell, sensing the prolonged silence, stepped back into the studio. He took in the scene, Sarah's pale face, Victoria's concerned expression, and the disturbing painting now displayed prominently. "Is everything all right?" he asked, moving to Sarah's side. Sarah turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time I told you the whole truth about who I am and why I'm here." As Sarah began to speak, Maxwell and Victoria exchanged glances, both realizing that the story about to unfold would change everything. The peaceful sanctuary of the Richardson estate was about to be shaken by revelations from Sarah's past, setting in motion events that would test the bonds of trust and compassion that had begun to form. The air in the studio grew heavy with anticipation as Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confession she was about to make. Maxwell and Victoria sat on nearby stools, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the mysterious painting, drawing strength from the raw truth it depicted. "My real name," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is Sarah Holloway. 7 years ago, I was Sarah Holloway Blackwell, wife of Christopher Blackwell, a prominent art dealer in New York. She paused, watching as recognition flickered in Victoria's eyes. Blackwell Galleries, Victoria murmured. They were at the center of a massive scandal involving art forgeries and money laundering. Sarah nodded, a bitter smile twisting her lips. That's right. What the public doesn't know is the full extent of Christopher's crimes, or the price I paid for uncovering them. As Sarah spoke, the story unfolded like a dark tapestry. She described her whirlwind romance with Christopher, their lavish wedding, and the birth of their daughter, Lily. For years, Sarah had been the perfect society wife, hosting galas and charity events while pursuing her own artistic career on the side. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks had begun to form. Christopher was charming in public, but behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative, Sarah explained, her hands clenching into fists. He discouraged my painting, saying it wasn't sophisticated enough for his circles. I didn't realize then that he was slowly isolating me, cutting me off from friends and family. Maxwell leaned forward, his face a mask of concern. Did he hurt you physically? Sarah's hesitation was answer enough. Not at first, she said softly. The abuse was emotional, psychological. But as I began to question some of his business practices, things escalated. She described how she had accidentally stumbled upon evidence of Christopher's illegal activities, forged provenance documents, communication with known criminals, and financial records that pointed to extensive money laundering through art sales. I was naive, Sarah admitted. I confronted him thinking he would explain that there must be some mistake. Instead, her voice trailed off and Maxwell instinctively reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Sarah took a shuddering breath before continuing. He threatened me, told me I'd lose everything, including Lily, if I breathed a word to anyone. For weeks I lived in terror, trying to gather evidence while pretending everything was normal. But Christopher must have suspected something. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Sarah's voice broke, and she gestured to a faint scar near her temple. Victoria gasped softly, while Maxwell's grip on Sarah's shoulder tightened protectively. That was the night I knew I had to leave, Sarah continued. Not just for my sake, but for Lily's. She was only 5, but she was already showing signs of anxiety, walking on eggshells around her father. I couldn't let her grow up in that environment. Sarah described her meticulous planning, how she had secretly reached out to an old friend, Claire, who agreed to take Lily while Sarah went into hiding. The hardest thing I've ever done was leaving my daughter, Sarah said, tears now flowing freely. But I knew Christopher would use her to control me if I took her with me. Claire promised to keep Lily safe and hidden until I could find a way to expose Christopher without putting us in danger. For the next part of her story, Sarah's voice grew stronger, fueled by a quiet anger. She told them about the years she spent gathering evidence, moving from city to city, always looking over her shoulder. She had taken odd jobs, slept in shelters, and slowly built a case against Christopher. About a month ago, I finally felt I had enough to go to the authorities, Sarah explained. I sent an anonymous tip to the FBI, along with copies of some of the evidence. But somehow Christopher found out. I barely escaped his men in Boston. That's how I ended up here, hiding in the woods behind your property. As Sarah's tale came to an end, the studio fell into a heavy silence. Maxwell was the first to speak, his voice gentle but firm. Sarah, you're not alone in this anymore. We'll help you finish what you started. We'll make sure Christopher is brought to justice. Victoria nodded in agreement, her professional demeanor softened by compassion. I have contacts in the art world and legal circles. We can use them to support your case and ensure your safety. Sarah looked between them, overwhelmed by their support. But what about Lily? It's been 7 years. She must think I abandoned her. We'll find her, Maxwell assured her, and we'll make sure she understands why you did what you did. You're a hero, Sarah, protecting your daughter at great personal cost. As the weight of her confession lifted, Sarah felt a mix of relief and trepidation. She had carried her secret for so long, the prospect of facing it head-on was both liberating and terrifying. Victoria, ever the strategist, was already formulating a plan. The exhibition, she said thoughtfully. We can use it as a way to draw Christopher out. If he sees your work, he'll know you've resurfaced. But this time you'll be ready for him. Maxwell nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. I have security connections from my business dealings. We can ensure the gallery and Sarah are protected, and I think it's time I called in a favor from an old friend in the FBI." As they began to outline their strategy, Sarah felt a spark of hope ignite within her. For years she had been running, hiding, surviving. Now, surrounded by allies, she dared to imagine a future where she could reclaim her life, her art, and most importantly, her daughter. The mysterious painting seemed to watch over them as they talked, a stark reminder of the pain Sarah had endured and the strength she had found. It was no longer just a piece of art, it was a declaration of truth, a testament to survival, and the first brushstroke of a new chapter in Sarah's life. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the studio, Sarah realized that her impulsive decision to seek shelter in Maxwell's garden had set in motion events that would change everything. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years she wasn't facing it alone. In the weeks following Sarah's confession, the Richardson estate buzzed with purposeful activity. The peaceful rhythm of daily life gave way to a sense of urgency as Maxwell, Victoria, and Sarah worked tirelessly to prepare for the upcoming exhibition and the confrontation it might bring. Maxwell's study became the nerve center of their operation. Maps, documents, and timelines covered every available surface, transforming the once orderly room into a war room of sorts. Sarah spent hours poring over the evidence she had gathered over the years, working with Maxwell to organize it into a compelling case against Christopher. One crisp morning, as sunlight streamed through the study's windows, Maxwell hung up the phone with a satisfied smile. "That was my contact at the FBI," he announced to Sarah, who was sketching ideas for new paintings. "Agent Daniels is on board. He's been looking for a way to bring down Christopher's operation for years, and your evidence might be the key." Sarah's pencil paused mid-stroke. "Do they think it's enough?" Maxwell nodded, his expression serious. "It's a strong start, but Agent Daniels believes the exhibition might draw out more players in Christopher's network. We'll need to be prepared for anything." As they discussed the implications, Victoria swept into the room, her arms full of glossy art magazines. "I've been laying the groundwork," she said, spreading the publications across Maxwell's desk. "Whispers about a mysterious new artist, hints of a groundbreaking exhibition. The art world is buzzing with speculation." Sarah picked up one of the magazines, her eyes widening as she saw a blurred image of one of her paintings. "How did you get this?" Victoria's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Let's just say I have my ways. Don't worry, I've been careful to keep your identity under wraps. We're creating intrigue without exposing you." As the three of them pored over the magazines, discussing strategies and potential risks, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door, a tray of tea and sandwiches in her hands. "You all need to eat," she said firmly, her motherly tone brooking no argument. They took a break, grateful for Mrs. Chen's thoughtfulness. As they ate, Maxwell noticed Sarah's gaze repeatedly drifting to a framed photo on his desk. It showed a much younger Maxwell standing next to an older man, both smiling broadly in front of a construction site. "That's my father," Maxwell explained, picking up the frame. "Richard Richardson. He built this company from the ground up." Sarah studied the photo closely. "You look so much like him," she observed, "except the eyes. Yours are different." Maxwell chuckled. "Everyone says that. I got my eyes from my mother, apparently, though I never knew her. She passed away when I was an infant." Something in Sarah's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, confusion. But before Maxwell could ask, Victoria steered the conversation back to the exhibition plans. As the day wore on, Sarah excused herself to return to the studio. The pressure of the upcoming show had reignited her creative fire, and she was working on a new series that she felt truly captured her journey. Alone in the studio, surrounded by the familiar scents of paint and turpentine, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Her eyes fell on the mysterious painting that had triggered her confession, the one she didn't remember creating. There was something about it that nagged at her, a detail just beyond her grasp. As she studied the painting, a memory surfaced, a conversation overheard years ago between Christopher and one of his less reputable associates. They had mentioned a name, a key player in their network of art fraud and money laundering. What was it? Sarah closed her eyes, willing the memory to sharpen. Suddenly it hit her. Richardson. They had mentioned the name Richardson. Sarah's eyes flew open, her heart pounding. Could it be a coincidence? She thought of the photo in Maxwell's study, of his offhand comment about his mother. With trembling hands, Sarah began a new painting, her brush moving almost of its own accord. As the image took shape, she gasped. It was a portrait of Maxwell, but with subtle changes, the set of his jaw, the angle of his cheekbones. She was painting him as he might have looked 30 years ago, and he was the spitting image of Christopher Blackwell. Sarah stumbled back from the easel, her mind reeling. Could it be possible? Was Maxwell somehow related to Christopher? And if so, did he know? As the implications of this potential connection dawned on her, Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again. She had come to trust Maxwell, to see him as a protector and ally, but now doubt crept in like a poisonous mist. Outside the studio, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah watched the fading light, feeling as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Should she confront Maxwell with her suspicions? Or was she letting her paranoia, born from years of fear and hiding, cloud her judgment? In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She would keep this revelation to herself, for now. She needed more information, more certainty, before potentially jeopardizing the trust and safety she had found at the Richardson estate. As darkness fell, Sarah covered the new portrait and turned to her exhibition pieces. There was still much work to be done, and the show would go on. But now, it carried an additional weight, not just the risk of confronting Christopher, but the possibility of uncovering a truth that could change everything. With a deep breath, Sarah picked up her brush again. Whatever secrets lay hidden in the past, she would face them head-on. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. The exhibition wasn't just about her art anymore. It was about bringing the truth to light, no matter how uncomfortable or surprising it might be. The night of the exhibition arrived, with a palpable tension in the air. The Chen Gallery, nestled in the heart of Manhattan's Chelsea Art District, hummed with anticipation. Victoria had transformed the space into a labyrinth of emotion, each room carefully curated to guide visitors through Sarah's artistic journey. Sarah stood in the back room, her heart pounding as she peered through a crack in the door. The gallery was filling up with New York's art elite, critics, collectors, and curious onlookers, drawn by the mysterious buzz surrounding the unknown artist. She caught glimpses of designer dresses and tailored suits, heard the murmur of excited conversations and the clink of champagne glasses. "Are you ready?" Maxwell's gentle voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to face him, struggling to reconcile the kind man before her with the unsettling possibility she had uncovered. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, smoothing down her simple black dress, a far cry from the haute couture she once wore to such events, but elegant in its understated simplicity. Maxwell squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Remember, you're not alone in this. Victoria and I are right here with you, and Agent Daniels has his team in place." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. The plan was for her to remain anonymous for most of the evening, observing reactions to her work from the sidelines. Only at the end of the night would she reveal herself as the artist, a moment that would hopefully draw out Christopher or his associates if they were present. As they stepped into the main gallery, Sarah was overwhelmed by the sight of her paintings on display. Each piece was a fragment of her soul, laid bare for the world to see. She watched as viewers moved from canvas to canvas, their expressions ranging from awe to confusion to deep emotion. Victoria appeared at their side, resplendent in a crimson gown. "It's going beautifully," she whispered excitedly. "I've already had inquiries from 3 major collectors, and the critics are buzzing." As they made their way through the crowd, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation. "The use of color is extraordinary. There's such pain in these brushstrokes. Who is this artist? It's like she's appeared out of nowhere." Sarah's anonymity allowed her to stand unnoticed near her paintings, hearing unfiltered reactions. It was both thrilling and terrifying. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to relax slightly. There had been no sign of Christopher or anyone from her past life. Perhaps they hadn't made the connection, or perhaps they weren't as vigilant as she had feared. Just as this thought crossed her mind, she felt Maxwell stiffen beside her. Following his gaze, Sarah's blood ran cold. There, entering the gallery with an air of entitled confidence, was Christopher Blackwell. He looked older than she remembered, his once dark hair now streaked with grey, but his presence still commanded attention. At his side was a young woman. With a start, Sarah realized it was Lily, her daughter. now a poised teenager of 15. Sarah instinctively stepped behind a pillar, her heart racing. She hadn't prepared herself for seeing Lily here, hadn't imagined the pain of being so close yet unable to reveal herself. Maxwell moved protectively in front of her. "Stay calm," he murmured. "We knew this was a possibility. Agent Daniels is aware they're here." Sarah nodded mutely, her eyes fixed on Lily. The girl moved through the gallery with a grace that reminded Sarah painfully of herself at that age. She watched as Lily paused in front of one of the larger paintings, a piece that Sarah had poured her longing and regret into. Christopher's voice, still as smooth and cultured as she remembered, carried across the room. "What do you think of this one, sweetheart?" Lily tilted her head, studying the canvas. "It's sad," she said softly, "but beautiful, like the artist is reaching out for something just beyond their grasp." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. Even after all these years, even without knowing who had created the painting, Lily could see into the heart of her mother's work. As Christopher and Lily moved deeper into the gallery, Sarah turned to Maxwell, her resolve strengthening. "I need to go through with the reveal," she said. "Not just for the plan, but for Lily. She deserves to know the truth." Maxwell studied her face, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back." Sarah nodded. "I've been hiding for too long. It's time to face this head on." With a silent nod to Victoria, who had been watching the situation unfold, the plan was set in motion. Victoria clinked her glass, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying over the crowd, "it is my great pleasure to introduce you to the artist behind these remarkable works. Please welcome Sarah Holloway." A hush fell over the gallery as Sarah stepped forward, emerging from behind the pillar. She heard gasps of recognition, saw Christopher's face drain of color, watched as Lily's eyes widened in shock and confusion. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's gaze locked with Christopher's, years of unspoken pain and anger passing between them. Then, breaking the spell, Christopher grabbed Lily's arm and began to push through the crowd towards the exit. "Wait," Sarah called out, her voice stronger than she expected. "Lily." But before she could move, chaos erupted. Agent Daniels and his team emerged from their positions, moving to block the exits. Christopher, realizing he was trapped, released Lily and made a desperate dash for a side door. In the commotion that followed, Sarah lost sight of Lily. She pushed through the stunned crowd, calling her daughter's name. Finally, she spotted her, standing alone and bewildered near one of the paintings. Sarah approached slowly, her heart pounding. "Lily," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. I know you must have so many questions." Lily turned, her eyes brimming with tears and a mix of emotions Sarah couldn't quite read. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, tentatively, Lily reached out and touched Sarah's arm as if making sure she was real. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. And in that single word, in the touch of her daughter's hand, Sarah felt years of pain and separation begin to crumble. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever explanations were needed, this moment, this reconnection, made everything worth it. As mother and daughter embraced, the gallery faded away around them. The exhibition, Christopher's arrest, the years of hiding, all of it paled in comparison to the simple, profound reality of being reunited at last. The days following the exhibition unfolded in a whirlwind of emotion and activity. Christopher's arrest made headlines, sending shockwaves through the art world and beyond. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm, her story of survival and artistic rebirth capturing the public's imagination. But for Sarah, the most important aftermath was much more personal. She and Lily were reunited, staying in a secure location provided by the FBI as they began the delicate process of reconnecting and healing. Their first real conversation was fraught with tension and unspoken pain. They sat across from each other in a cozy living room, cups of untouched tea growing cold between them. "Why?" Lily finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave me?" Sarah's heart ached at the hurt in her daughter's eyes. "Oh, Lily," she said, fighting back tears. "Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. I thought I was protecting you from your father's world, from the danger he brought into our lives. But I see now how much pain my absence caused you." Lily's hands trembled as she clutched her mug. He told me you abandoned us, that you chose your art over your family. Never, Sarah said firmly, reaching out to touch Lily's hand. You were always in my heart, always my motivation to keep going, to find a way to make things right. As they talked, Sarah shared the full story of Christopher's crimes, the abuse she had endured, and her years in hiding. Lily listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger to understanding. I always felt like there was something off about Dad, Lily admitted. But I never imagined... Sarah nodded, understanding all too well the complexity of loving someone capable of such deception. Your father is a master manipulator. He fooled a lot of people for a long time. As their conversation deepened, Lily began to open up about her own experiences, the loneliness, the confusion, and the solace she had found in art. I started painting a few years ago, she said shyly. I felt connected to you somehow when I did. Sarah's heart swelled with pride and bittersweet joy. I'd love to see your work sometime, she said softly. As mother and daughter began to bridge the gap of lost years, Maxwell was facing his own turmoil. Sarah's suspicions about his possible connection to Christopher weighed heavily on her mind, and she knew she had to confront him with the truth. A week after the exhibition, Sarah met Maxwell at his estate. The familiar surroundings felt different now, charged with unspoken tension. They sat in his study, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. Maxwell, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. There's something I need to ask you, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Maxwell leaned forward, concern etched on his face. Of course, Sarah. What is it? Taking a deep breath, Sarah revealed her suspicions. The overheard conversation years ago, the striking resemblance she had noticed in the old photograph. As she spoke, she watched Maxwell's expression change from confusion to shock to a deep, pained understanding. When she finished, Maxwell was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photo of himself and his father. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. I had no idea, he said softly. But now that you've pointed it out, I can't unsee it. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older and more vulnerable than Sarah had ever seen him. My father. He wasn't always the most faithful husband. There were rumors, but I never paid them much attention. Could it be possible that Christopher and I... Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. I don't know for certain, she said, but I think it's a possibility we need to explore. Maxwell nodded, his mind clearly racing. We'll need a DNA test to be sure. But Sarah, I want you to know, if this is true, if Christopher and I are indeed half-brothers, it doesn't change how I feel about you or Lily. I'm on your side in this no matter what. The sincerity in his eyes brought tears to Sarah's. She realized that in her years of running and hiding, she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand so firmly in her corner. As they sat there, the weight of this potential revelation settling around them, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, certainly. Fear of what this could mean for their fight against Christopher. Fear of how it might complicate the delicate new balance she was finding with Lily. But there was also a sense of relief, of pieces finally falling into place. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell squeezed her hand gently. We face it together, he said firmly. We get the test done, and whatever the results, we deal with it as a family. You, me, Lily, we're in this together now. As the sun set outside, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with legal battles, emotional reckonings, and the challenge of rebuilding trust. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone on that road. Sarah thought of her paintings, of the journey they represented, from darkness to light, from isolation to connection. She realized that her life was mirroring her art, each brush stroke of fate leading her towards a canvas she could never have imagined. As she and Maxwell began to discuss their next steps, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever revelations lay ahead, whatever challenges they might face, she was ready to face them head-on, not just for herself, but for Lily, for Maxwell, and for the truth that had been hidden for far too long. The story was far from over, but a new chapter was beginning, one filled with the promise of healing, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of legal proceedings, emotional conversations, and tentative steps towards a new normal. As the art world continued to buzz about Sarah's triumphant return and Christopher's dramatic downfall, Sarah, Lily, and Maxwell focused on navigating their newly complicated relationships. The DNA test results arrived on a crisp autumn morning. Maxwell had insisted on being present when Sarah opened the envelope, and Lily, who had been informed of the possibility, chose to join them. They gathered in Maxwell's study, the tension palpable as Sarah's trembling fingers broke the seal. As she scanned the document, her eyes widened. "It's true," she whispered, looking up at Maxwell. "You and Christopher are half-brothers." The revelation hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "All these years," he murmured, "and I never knew." Lily, who had been quiet throughout, suddenly spoke up. "Does this mean you're my uncle?" she asked Maxwell, her voice a mix of confusion and wonder. Maxwell looked at the young girl, seeing traces of himself in her features for the first time. "I suppose it does," he said softly, a small smile breaking through his shock. As the implications of this new reality settled over them, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. The truth, as complicated as it was finally out in the open. There were no more secrets, no more hidden connections waiting to be uncovered. In the days that followed, they worked together to process this new information. Maxwell, driven by a need to understand his past, dove into researching his father's history, uncovering a web of secrets and liaisons that painted a complex picture of the man he thought he knew. For Lily, the revelation brought mixed emotions. On one hand, it gave her a connection to a family beyond her parents, an uncle who had shown nothing but kindness and support. On the other, it forced her to confront the reality of her father's deceptions on an even deeper level. Sarah watched as Lily and Maxwell began to forge a tentative bond, united by their shared shock and the desire to move forward. She saw how Maxwell's gentle guidance and genuine interest in Lily's art helped to draw the girl out of her shell, providing a positive male influence that had been sorely lacking in her life. As the legal proceedings against Christopher progressed, Sarah found herself having to revisit painful memories. But now she didn't face them alone. Maxwell was there, offering unwavering support, while Lily's presence reminded her of why she had fought so hard for so long. One evening, as they sat together in the garden of Maxwell's estate, Lily asked the question that had been lingering unspoken between them. "Mum, what happens now, with us, I mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, looking at her daughter's face in the soft twilight. "That's up to you, sweetheart. I know I can't just walk back into your life and expect everything to be perfect. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We can take this as slowly as you need." Lily nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'd like to try," she said softly. "To be a family again, I mean. With you and with Uncle Max too, if that's okay." Maxwell, who had been giving them space, looked up in surprise at the use of Uncle Max. His eyes met Sarah's over Lily's head, a silent understanding passing between them. "I'd be honored," Maxwell said, his voice thick with emotion. As they sat there in the gathering dusk, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was still uncertain. There were wounds to heal, relationships to rebuild, and a new family dynamic to navigate. But for the first time in years, she felt hopeful about the future. In the studio, Sarah's paintings took on a new quality. The darkness and pain were still there, but now they were balanced by strokes of light and color that spoke of renewal and hope. She began a new series, one that explored the complex bonds of family, not just the family we're born into, but the family we choose and create. As autumn deepened into winter, the Richardson estate became a haven of healing and new beginnings. Lily began spending weekends there, her laughter bringing life to rooms that had long been silent. Maxwell threw himself into the role of uncle with gusto, his natural warmth and kindness helping to bridge the years of separation between mother and daughter. Sarah watched it all with a heart full of gratitude and amazement. The journey had been long and painful, filled with sacrifices and hardships she could never have imagined. But as she stood in her studio, surrounded by her art and the sounds of her newfound family, she knew that every step had led her to this moment. The final painting in her new series was a large canvas that dominated the studio. It depicted three figures, a woman, a man, and a young girl, standing together against a backdrop that blended the chaos of the past with the promise of the future. As Sarah put the finishing touches on it, she felt as though she was not just creating art, but writing the first chapter of a new story, one of truth, reconciliation, and the unbreakable bonds of love that can emerge from even the darkest of circumstances. As she stepped back to survey her work, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. Lily and Maxwell entered the studio, their faces lighting up as they saw the painting. "It's us," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah nodded, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "It's our new beginning," she said softly. And as they stood there together, bathed in the warm light of the studio, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, bound not just by blood, but by choice, by understanding, and by a love that had weathered the fiercest of storms.